My friends, Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast is really turning into the offensive of the broken dreams. Now the situation is more critical than ever. This is how the Ukrainian operation started. And this is the situation now. In early September, our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia controlled about 900 square kilometers inside Russia. They had effectively turned the tables and the bulge was expanding quickly. But now, by mid-November, their breachhead inside Russia is slowly getting shattered, as they're now down to 600 square kilometers. Whoops, and now it's down to 550 square kilometers. The worst is that everything started so well for Ukraine, but then the Kurskaya Michta, the Kursk dream, started collapsing. Here from the Independent, Ukraine is facing a hammer blow of 50,000 Russian troops in Kursk. Can they hold out? All I can tell you is that Kursk Oblast is definitely important to the Ukrainian command. Because while the front is falling apart in the South Donetsk direction, more and more Ukrainian reinforcements are sent north to hold the line in Kursk, including famous formations like airborne units, the Marines, the 47th Mechanized Brigade with its M2A2 Bradleys and M1A1 Abrams. And that's not all. Ukraine also fired Storm Shadow cruise missiles and US-made ATACMS missiles right into Russian territory. Overall, the Ukrainians lost 119 visually confirmed pieces of equipment or vehicles in Kursk. For an army already struggling with a shortage of equipment, this is a disaster. From a military perspective, Ukraine's adventure in Kursk was costly. Like Ukrainian General Krivonos said, the Russians understand that it will be difficult for us to increase the pressure in Kursk. There are no powerful reserves, especially since a lot of Ukrainian troops in that sector are composed of poorly trained, mobilized personnel. These conscripts are literally sacrificed to hold untenable positions and just absorb Russian artillery shells. It's so tragic, I don't even know what to say. That's also perhaps why we're seeing a growing number of these formations just yell "GG well played" and abandon their combat positions.
Shameful display! All hope is failing, my lord! The battle is almost done!
We are winning!
So why are they stubbornly holding on to this breachhead? At first glance, many consider the Kursk offensive as a futile waste of resources, drawing some of Ukraine's best troops away from the real danger in Donbass. But I'm convinced that there's more to this story and that there's a political objective behind this operation. So to fully understand what was the point of the Kursk offensive, we first have to go through a step-by-step analysis of combat operations since August. And we'll end with what I personally think are the true motives behind Ukraine's Pasilenie Nastuplenie, the last offensive. If you're wondering how I keep up with all the political news related to the Ukraine war, it's because I use this app and website by Ground News for my research. While browsing in the section related to Ukraine, I found this story. US says it intends to shore up support for Ukraine until Trump takes office. Ground News found over 107 articles covering this story, 17 politically left-leaning, 6 on the right, but as you can see in this biased distribution, the majority of articles lay in the center. Not surprisingly, 92% of the sources are rated with high or very high factuality. This is great since I want to learn more from neutral fact-based sources. If that's something that interests you, you can also access Ground News by using my link in the description below. ground.news/HistoryLegends to access the Vantage plan. That's the one I use and they're offering 50% off right now for a limited time. Overall, in the bias comparison section, we see how the left emphasizes the effects of Russia's intensified strikes, while the right focuses on the future US and NATO support to Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, the majority of sources that could be geolocated stem from the United States. On top of that, if you want to learn more, you can select similar news topics that you're interested in. Another interesting feature is how I can filter articles. Let's say I want an article with very high factuality and no paywall. Bingo, I got 2 articles, one by France 24 and one by AP. What's cool is that by hovering on the +2, I see that the Star Kuala Lumpur and the Straits Times reposted this article by France 24, giving it more legitimacy. Personally, as someone fascinated by warfare and geopolitics, Ground News is an invaluable tool that cuts through the noise. Ground News is offering my viewers 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year and it will only be available for a limited time. If you're already a subscriber, don't worry, you can send Ground News as a gift for 50% off as well. So make sure to use my link in the description below. I think Ground News is doing important work and I hope you'll check them out. Not only will you support the headquarters, but you'll also support a small team looking to hold the media accountable. My friends, to truly understand what is going on in Kursk Oblast, we have no other choice but to start where we last left off in mid-August. August 2024. As you can see on the map, by the 21st of August, the Ukrainians were fighting right on the outskirts of Korinieva, inside the village of Krasnotabryaskoye along the river Seym, as well as on the eastern side of Sudzha. Overall, by that point, there were multiple objectives open to the Ukrainian command. Let's go through them. The first one was to storm the city of Korinieva. That urban settlement would provide a suitable strongpoint to protect the salient. But that battle was not necessarily suitable for Ukraine's lightly armored attack force. The second was to clear the southern bank of the same river to protect the western flank of the salient. The open terrain would be more suitable, but there was a lot of ground to take over. What you have to know is that in Kursk Oblast, the Ukrainian command actively used forested areas to conceal the location of its troops, and has large parking areas for all its vehicles and equipment. In response, Russian aircraft essentially dropped massive loads at random through the bushes. You know, a bit like the board game Battleship, but on the ground. Let's call this new version Battleship. In the end, using various geolocated footage, it seemed the Ukrainian army started pushing massively westwards. We know the Ukrainian command started pushing towards the village of Kamarovka, both from this direction as well as this one. There, Russian drone operators of the 200 Separate Motor Rifle Brigade targeted the Ukrainian tank driving through the village. In this footage, a US-made M113 APC and a Turkish Kirpi were targeted on the road from Vishnevaka to Kamarovka. At the same moment, a Russian recon drone spotted a Ukrainian Kirpi that tried to find concealment in some woods. This unit was hiding in the forested areas north of Apanasovka, as part of this attack force driving towards Kamarovka. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force supported this offensive push by dropping Freedom Fabs, also known as GBU-39B SDB bombs, on the town of Glushkovo. As you can see, the Russians in that sector were slowly getting squeezed out. The Ukrainian command probably expected them to withdraw to the northern side of the river, especially since HIMARS and Ukrainian aircraft tag-teamed and destroyed all the bridges across that river. But it seems Russian engineers were able to continue the flow of supplies through a multitude of pontoon bridges. With that being said, the Russian headquarters understood that these pontoon bridges were only a temporary solution, as some sectors could only be resupplied with little fishing boats. So, no spoilers, but the Russians were preparing a surprise. By the 23rd of August, the Ukrainians gained a little bit more ground in Krasnotabryaskoye, as well as outside of Sudzha. There, the gray zone expanded 4 kilometers beyond the town. For instance, in the village of Ruskaya Konopelka, a Ukrainian tank driving inside the settlement was hit by Russian Lancet kamikaze drones. Meanwhile, Ukrainian infantrymen were deployed in the first houses of the neighboring settlement of Cherkaskaya Konopelka. We could think that the Ukrainian objective was to push along this highway all the way to Belitsa, especially since a number of Russian forces were pinned down due to the Ukrainian presence in Borky. Now, the reason why this area was marked as being part of the gray zone is because all these settlements were heavily contested. For example, in the village of Ruskaya Konopelka, a Russian BMP-3 lit up an M113 APC, then engaged a Cossack 7 before blasting a BMP-2. Meanwhile, several other Cossack APCs were scattered and lay destroyed, as Ukrainian infantrymen were seen running left and right from house to house. On the 26th of August, we can mention how a number of Ukrainian light armored vehicles were targeted by enemy drones as they pushed out of Nizhnapnaye, in yet another attempt to push towards Glushkovo. 3 days later, Russian forces launched a limited counterattack and expelled Ukrainian forces from Korinieva. However, something was in the air, something was brewing. the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk reached its maximum expansion, and allegedly by that point 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers were involved in this operation. Now, as you can see, the rate of advance of the Ukrainian army had significantly decreased compared to the first days of the operation. That's mostly because after the initial strike, Ukraine's elite shock units were rotated out and replaced by lower quality mobilized personnel, whose job was just to sit in trenches and hold the ground. This would be later confirmed by the commander of the Pyatnashka brigade of the DPR. He said, "Now the quality of the Ukrainian military near Kursk has dropped, since members of territorial battalions are now being sent there." September 2024. The front didn't change much in the first week of September, but with the front stagnating, Russian airstrikes also became more frequent, like these FAB-500 bombs that were dropped on tree lines near the village of Vyitrina. On the other side, Ukrainian HIMARS continued to destroy the various pontoon bridges across the same river that kept popping up. However, Igor Zabildir and his team of Russian engineers managed to rebuild the bridges faster than the Ukrainians could take them out. Like we said before, the Ukrainian command was looking at all this and expected the Russians to pull the logical move and withdraw north of the river. But they forgot that they're facing the Russians. And what did they do?
We dig in.
The Ukrainian HQ found out why the Russians were so stubbornly holding to Glushkova on the 10th of September. Here we see a column of 8 Russian BMDs and tanks of the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment pushing along a road before cutting across fields. Then we see them arrive in some urban area. The big drama is that this armored unit was geolocated right inside the village of Snagost, 7 kilometers from the contact line. Even Jason Love would be jealous of such deep thrust. In this first-person shooter experience, we see a column consisting of 9 armored vehicles of that same airborne regiment concealing their attack across wheat fields. Also notice how the Russian BMD amphibious infantry fighting vehicle can only carry 5 passengers. So the remaining 3 men of a standard Russian infantry squad have to sit on top. I wonder how they decide who's gonna sit where. Bratan, who of you can speak English? Haha, you guys sit on top. In the video description of that video, we learned that this vanguard reached Snagost without suffering losses in armored vehicles, mainly due to the enemy's lack of anti-tank weapons. Then the vehicles disembarked the paratroopers, which secured the foothold in the settlement until the main forces arrived. So as the Ukrainians were pushing westwards towards Glushkova, this surprise attack from the north completely shattered their right flank. 24 hours later, the following footage was released, where we see a group of 3 BMDs of the 137th Paratrooper Regiment, right after they successfully disembarked their infantry component. Back to the map, this would mean Russian troops were now roaming around these woods. By the 12th of September, heavy street-to-street fighting took place inside Snagost. But that was not the worst, because while all this was taking place, Russian reconnaissance units cleared the Yaponovsky forest and the village of Krasnoktobryaskoye. By the 13th of September, Russian paratroopers raised their banner on top of Snagost, more specifically the Russian flag, but also the one of the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment. We can even notice the flag of the Wagner PMC. This could possibly indicate that a number of these Storm detachments were composed of former Wagnerians. So we mentioned the 137th Paratrooper Regiment, as well as the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment. Interestingly, both these units belonged to the 106th Airborne Division that was previously holding the Siversk sector. And remember, I even mentioned them in one of my previous reports. But the second one is centered on Siversk. There, it's the 106th Guards Airborne Division that was tasked with putting down this stubborn bulge. On the 4th of June, Russian paratroopers of the 137th Regiment from Ryazan launched a motorized attack on Razdolivka along the railway line. Now it will also be interesting to know if the 119th Airborne Regiment is also deployed in Kursk Oblast. In that case, the Russian command transferred the entire 106th Airborne Division to lead this counteroffensive. That means about 10,000 Russian paratroopers were concentrated right on this Schwerpunkt, while this entire Ukrainian breachhead is defended by 10,000 soldiers. GG, well played. And the worst is that how did the Ukrainians not notice the transfer of an entire division?
I'm blind in my left eye and 43% blind in my right eye. I don't see much of nothing.
Jokes aside, the way the Russian military pulled off this maskirovka will have to be studied. It's not a surprise that by the 14th of September, the Ukrainian command ordered all its spearheads to fall back. This meant mission accomplished for the 106th Airborne Division. The Russian Glushkova tactical grouping could once again be resupplied. But the Kursk nightmare just started, because now elements of the 106th Airborne Division cleared the entire sector south of Snagost. At the same time, Russian armored units tailed the retreating Ukrainians, and even managed to shove it in right inside Lyubimovka. Look, players gotta play. The move was ambitious, but in the end the tip of the Russian forces could not push deeper. In this footage, Russian paratroopers attacked with a column of 14 vehicles, 2 tanks, 11 BMD amphibious infantry fighting vehicles, and 1 armored personnel carrier. According to the Ukrainians, the Russians left behind 1 tank, 5 BMDs, and 1 APC. As for casualties, there's no number, but as you can expect, it must have been pretty significant. Now what's crazy is that at the same time, some Ukrainian forces in the north secured Olgovka, and even got a foothold 3 kilometers beyond the settlement right along the railway line east of Korenieva. Oh, and I almost forgot! Throughout this entire battle, for weeks, we could see Russian cyborgs cling on to their positions in Kremanoye, although they were completely encircled. And my friends, if this battle could not get more spectacular, Ukraine launched its own response to the Russian counteroffensive by flanking the enemy's flanking maneuver south of Glushkova. Like in some sort of cavalry battle, everyone was trying to flank each other. In this video, you can see how this Ukrainian engineering vehicle breaks through the dragon's teeth positioned along the border, with a tank waiting just behind. Moments later, a squad of Ukrainian infantrymen also crossed the border. In this other footage, you can see 3 Ukrainian vehicles quickly driving from one tree line to another before reaching that same line of dragon teeth. Now what's interesting is that the drone operators recording all this belong to the Horny group or Horn group, which is an aerial unit attached to the 116th Mechanized Brigade, once again possibly indicating that at least part of the brigade is deployed along the Kursk front. Well, these guys, they're special. There's a story I read online where one of their quadcopters packed with explosives detonated right after takeoff. Luckily, the drone operators were not injured. Neither were the journalists and all the camera crew recording them. But then one of these drone operators turns around, and this is what he told the reporter next to him. Horn doesn't care where the blood flows. Let's go back to combat operations. In this footage, you can see an epic shot of another armored unit racing across the Russia-Ukraine border. We also know that the 225th Assault Battalion took part in this operation. Here we see some of their vehicles in action. In the end, that's how forward elements of the AFU pushed 3 kilometers, reaching the outskirts of Vyesloye. They could almost grasp glory. One more push and they were inside Glushkovo. Then we have footage of yet another Ukrainian attack. In this one, we see armored vehicles pushing across open field before being stopped by swarms of FPV drones. One of the targeted vehicles was this T-64 BV tank, and next to it is a Cossack 7. Now if we look at the map, the Ukrainians advanced like that and got halted right here. We can speculate that their maneuver intended to push right towards Nova Ivanivka and put simply penetrate the Russians from the rear. Despite the critical situation, the Ukrainian media tried to portray the Kursk offensive as boosting the morale of the entire army. For example, here they showed the reaction of Ukrainian soldiers that returned from captivity when they learned about combat operations now taking place in Russia. On the 15th of September, the Ukrainians launched a major attack, which ended up bypassing Vyesloye. Here, a Leopard 2 and a CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle packed with riflemen push under the cover of a smokescreen. From all the footage I saw in that sector, most of the Russian response consisted of drone strikes. And notice the equipment used by these Ukrainian troops. This was a heavily equipped task force. That same day, the Financial Times released this article, Russia dials up pressure on Ukraine's Kursk offensive, where they then report, Zelensky has said Russia will need about 100,000 troops to push his forces out. Bruv, one Russian airborne division was enough to tear you guys a new one. However, by the 17th of September, Ukrainian forces got stopped here and here. Their last move was to flank Vyesloye from the west and hope that it would force the Russians to abandon the village. Here we see a Cossack 7 that got damaged, and the driver lost control of the vehicle, which then flipped on its side. The Cossack 7 was geolocated right here while pushing along this road. Now thinking about it, if the Ukrainians got halted there, the immediate tactical objective could have been the capture of these two hamlets, Krasno-Oktyabryarsky and Valfina, and then use these settlements as a stepping stone into Vyeseloye. But anyway, that failed as well. It just seems the Ukrainians didn't have enough reserves available to counterattack. I really think it was only this 225th Assault Battalion that launched the attack with whatever was available at that time. By the 18th, Russian paratroopers advanced 3 kilometers and cleared the settlement of Obukhovka. In this video, we see 2 Russian BMDs approach these woods, and instead of landing the troops right at the edge of the tree line, as they usually do, this time the armored vehicles disembarked the riflemen at about 30 meters away. I don't know, probably because of the risk of enemy anti-tank weapons. While this battle was going on near Snagost, firefights also erupted on the northern side of the salient. Their Swedish-made Stridsvagn 122 was destroyed by 2 Russian FPV drones, whose strikes led to a detonation of the tank's ammunition. This was probably part of a Ukrainian attempt to expand their area of control in that direction, because by the 21st of September, it was reported that Ukrainian forces advanced 4 kilometers and made some gains east of Pragrepki. So let's summarize, we have a Russian offensive in this direction, a Ukrainian counteroffensive in this one, and further Ukrainian attacks in the north. As for the sector of Sudzha, no major territorial changes could be reported. Here's a quick summary of what happened in the past 7 days, because, no spoilers, the Russians were also preparing something. On the 11th of September, a Russian 4-post UAV destroyed 2 Ukrainian tanks parked on the outskirts of Sudzha. Where was the air defense? They have one job. On the 12th of September, Russian artillery shelled Ukraine positions in Cherkasskoye Parishnoye, indicating that the Ukrainians did in fact hold the settlement. However, most of the action took place further south near Borki. For example, the village of Plichava saw heavy shelling. From the footage I saw that I can't show you, the effects of the shelling were, there were a number of casualties after this bombardment. And it seemed to me that this sector was held by Ukrainian Mobiks, just by the way they reacted to this artillery shelling. These guys were literally tasked to sit in trenches and absorb enemy shells. Now as for Borki proper, first Russian artillery bombarded the village, causing a number of Ukrainian squads to pull out early. You can force a man to hold an AK, but you can't force him to fight. By the 16th of September, Russian soldiers of the 382nd Battalion of the 810th Marine Brigade launched an attack south of Borki and captured these farm buildings in the process. Interestingly, these Marines were supported by men of the Arbat unit, aka the Armenian Battalion of the International Pyatnashka Brigade. Fast forward to the 23rd of September to the main area of operations. The Ukrainians renewed an attack against Vyeseloye. However, the armored vehicles got stopped by a minefield on the southern entrance of the village. During this firefight, the Russians also reported the loss of an LSTS 1944 Sarmat 3, which is the first time it is seen on the battlefield. I don't know, to me it just looks as if it was left unattended in the north of Paris. Because of this Ukrainian flank maneuver, the Russian command definitely pressed on the brakes in order to deal with this dangerous Ukrainian operation.
Send in our reinforcements.
In this post, we learned that it was men from the 1st Battalion, 119th Airborne Regiment, and men from the 1st Battalion, 51st Airborne Regiment, supported by elements of the 56th Guards Air Assault Regiment, that ended up stopping the Ukrainian offensive south of Glushkava once and for all. Oh, and did you hear that? 119th Airborne Regiment. That means the trilogy is complete. All 3 VDV regiments of the 106th Airborne Division are deployed in Kursk. Interestingly, this 56th Air Assault Regiment was transferred from the Kherson front. So this means the Russians don't actually have that many reserves available. They literally had to scramble units from various secondary fronts. Or it's because the Russian army didn't want to man the front with conscripts or untrained reserve units. In that case, the objective was to clear the Kursk Salient ASAP with elite assault detachments. The Financial Times interviewed a person close to the Russian military establishment, which stated, Apart from a few Marine brigades, we didn't bring any good reserves there. As you've seen by now in this video, this is a big lie. At least 4 elite airborne regiments were transferred from various parts of the front to dislodge the Ukrainians from their positions in Kursk Oblast. Put simply, all these Russian assault formations could have been used in other sectors, but now they're stuck in Kursk. Now, once the Russians had more or less contained this Ukrainian flanking maneuver, they resumed offensive operations.
That was a close call.
On the 28th of September, Russian paratroopers advanced another 1,700 meters all the way to the Snagost River. The next day, however, Ukrainian formations were spotted north of Vyseloye, possibly indicating that the settlement had finally fallen. Or so they thought. However, by looking at the footage, those seemed to be very light vehicles, possibly just a Ukrainian recon mission led by some sabotage groups. Overall, from an operational perspective, there was a lot of movement throughout September, and it became clear that the Ukrainian army was now on the back foot. October 2024. By the 1st of October, Deep State UA showed how Vyseloye was almost encircled. The capture of this village was essential for the Ukrainian counteroffensive to be successful. However, Ukrainian losses in vehicles started stacking up. Here we see about 16 armored vehicles abandoned or destroyed along the main road leading to Vyseloye, including equipment like the Striker, the M113 APC, the Mada 1A3, the M2A2 Bradley, the Cossack 7, Max Pro MRAP, Kirpi, and many more. What can I say? What a tragedy. Meanwhile, the Russians continued their steady push south of Abuhavka. As for the Sudzha sector, a Ukrainian infantry unit was caught under artillery fire while heading towards Plehovo. Notice the complete lack of armored vehicles to complete this evacuation. Ukrainian soldiers literally have to sprint through artillery fire. The front then remained relatively stable for a couple days, until the 6th of October, when the Russian 106th Airborne Division finally cleared these woods and advanced a total of 3 kilometers. They also got a foothold inside the northern part of the village of Lyubimovka. In this video you can see how an abandoned Ukrainian Russian senator was destroyed on the eastern part of the village. You will notice that there were relatively few Ukrainian armored losses in the sector around Snagost. This means the Russians literally attacked the soft belly of the Kursk Salient. From a tactical perspective, the loss of this forest was a big problem, because there were barely any terrain features in close proximity that could stop the Russians. Only this forested sector, the Snagost River, and maybe the settlement of Novoivanovka. But even then, if we look at a 3D map, the place is essentially one street surrounded by trees. There's not any large building or structure that could be used as a defensive node. It's not a surprise that on the 10th of October, the Russians attacked right towards this sector. In this footage, we see a lone BMD just pushing across field facing little enemy fire. From a 3D perspective, that was the angle of the drone, and we see how the Russian armored vehicle disembarked the infantry squad right at this location. What was shocking, however, was that the forward elements of the 106th Airborne Division advanced 10 kilometers all the way to Leonidova. We even have a snippet of how they did it. We see a Ukrainian tank protecting a road and then quickly falling back as it is being chased by 3 Russian armored vehicles from the 155th Brigade of the Pacific Fleet. What's interesting is that we would have expected the Russian Marines to attack along the main road leading to Novoivanovka, but no. According to the footage, this crossroad was protected by the Ukrainian tank we just saw. Now the 3 BMPs actually attacked the position from this direction, from the north. During the surprise attack and breakthrough by the Russian armed forces, a group of 9 Ukrainian UAV operators were caught by the Russians. As you know, usually they sit behind the front line, but the Russian advance was so rapid that they didn't have time to pack up and escape. Now the drama is that it seems that they all got shot. No prisoners were taken. From what I read in various Telegram channels, drone operators have a very bad reputation in this war, just like snipers in World War II. By the 11th of October, the Russians also counterattacked around Vyseloye and regained control of the fields on the eastern side of the village. That's how a number of Ukrainian infantry squads suddenly found themselves surrounded by hostile forces. while most of them were able to escape. Here we have footage of a failed Ukrainian evacuation mission, as an enemy drone struck right at the moment as riflemen boarded the vehicle. Now you also understand why drone operators have a bad reputation. They have no mercy. No respite for Ukraine, because the next day Russian attacks continued. Now the Ukrainians regained control of Leonidova and the eastern part of Novoivanovka, but the Russian armed forces still controlled a very dangerous bulge. Further south, the Ukrainians abandoned Borky and now recentered their positions on the outskirts of Pliechava. 13th of October and collapse of Ukrainian positions around Kareneva.
Объезжайте, тут налево уходите. После лесополки? Да. Только поворот. Наводчику туда.
As you can see on the map, the Ukrainian command then concentrated its forces around the village of Olgovka, as well as these two forested areas we mentioned earlier. But apart from that, everything else was abandoned. That's also when the Russian cyborgs of Kremalnoye were rescued. The situation was difficult for Ukraine because heavy fighting continued around Lyubimovka. It was a pure battle of attrition. Under the pressure of the enemy, a group of 30 Ukrainian soldiers were spotted marching in calm formation as they retreated towards the Snagost River, either as part of a coordinated rotation or because they abandoned their combat positions. It was reported that on the Russian side, fighting was mainly carried out by units of the 155th Marine Brigade of the Pacific Fleet, but also of the newly arrived 83rd Separate Guards Air Assault Brigade. So now in this front that is absolutely not important to the Russian military, we have the 155th Marine Brigade that fought in the Novomikhailivka sector and the 83rd Air Assault Brigade that was deployed in Vovchansk. This also means we have visual evidence of the deployment of at least 5 Russian airborne formations. On the eastern side of the salient, the 204th Special Forces Regiment Akhmat from Chechnya started softening Ukrainian positions around Martinovka by swarming the place with FPV drone strikes. But it seems the Ukrainians there were too heavily entrenched to be dislodged. But suddenly this new wave of Russian counterattacks came to a stop, and the situation on the Kursk front stabilized for about a week. It was literally a miracle. That's because Deep State UA reported how the 225th Assault Battalion was now used to repel Russian counterattacks in that sector. The enemy no longer has such easy breakthroughs as on October 10th. Problem is, these firefighters can't be everywhere. On October 20th, Russian assault detachments swarmed this force that was turned into a bastion, a stronghold. And after that, it all collapsed. The Ukrainians quickly pulled out from Olgovka, and withdrew 4 kilometers all the way to this forest. At the same time, not far from there, Russian paratroopers and marines cleared Lyubimovka and pushed another 2 kilometers to the banks of the Snagost River. I know it will sound repetitive, but once again a number of Ukrainian units found themselves isolated. And even worse, it's not Hollywood, nobody would come to rescue them.
Cowards! Our men flee the battlefield! How can they call themselves men?
These Mobigs had no other choice but to reach friendly lines by their own means, like this remainder of a company, about 30 men, that retreated to Zelyeny Shlях. After that, no major territorial changes could be reported for the next 10 days. That's because elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade showed up in Kursk Oblast, more specifically in the village of Novoivanovka. These poor guys are always sacrificed to salvage the worst tactical situations. Here we see an M2A2 Bradley in action, as well as an M1A1 Abrams. Let's say I would not want to be these Russian soldiers in these buildings.
Fuck.
Oh yeah, and on the 22nd of October, Ukrainian Marines of the 36th Brigade also showed up in the Kursk Salient. This battle has become so important that now the elite of the AFU is now concentrated right there. We can also mention how on the 26th of October, a Ukrainian task force composed of the 21st and 47th Mechanized Brigades attacked this tree line south of Vysyeloye. In this footage, we see a Swedish CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle that was destroyed shortly after having crossed the border. Eventually, just like with the previous attempts, and due to the lack of progress, Ukrainian forces withdrew from their positions around Vysyeloye. The Ukrainian Glushkova counteroffensive was defeated. Shortly after, we could even see Russian engineers going back to repair the border wall. Man, Trump would be so jealous. Apart from that, by the end of October, the Russians mentioned how hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were trapped in this forest. I mean, they were encircled on 3 sides and only had a 2-kilometer window to escape. At the same time, the Ukrainian command turned these woods into real bastions. But how long can they hold out? In this video, Russian artillery and drones continuously struck the Ukrainian units hiding in these woods. Some preferred to risk everything and just escape through the open ground. November 2024. Now we arrive with the latest news at the front. The Kursk sector did not change much in the first 10 days of November. But there was something that happened on the 1st of November that I wanted to mention. Ukrainian Major General Dmitry Marchenko, who successfully defended Mykolaiv in 2022, now publicly complained about the purpose of the Kursk operation. Surprise, surprise, a couple days later, the SBU made an offer he could not refuse. Marchenko suddenly fell very sick and resigned from his position. Now, although it might not seem fair, but a military structure needs to show cohesion and cannot allow dissenting opinions to be made publicly. The Russian Ministry of Defense did the same thing with one of their generals in the summer of 2023. On the 7th of November, the paras of the 51st Regiment tried to outflank Leonidovo by storming the settlement along these woods. They did so with 14 vehicles, 5 BMP-3s, 2 BMD-2s, and the rest chugged bottles of vodka and charged aboard buggies. In one of my previous videos, I already talked about this new tactic of using quads, buggies, and motorcycles to attack enemy trenches. But the local Russian commander certainly did not get the memo on how to actually use them. On the 10th of November, the New York Times reported 50,000 Russian and North Korean troops mass ahead of attack, US says. In reality, you can safely divide the actual strength of both sides by 2. The Russians were preparing a big push against the Kursk Salient, and they massively bombarded the entire sector before launching the attack. They did so with artillery pieces like this 152mm 2S-43 Malva wheeled gun. On the 10th of November, the Russians launched a major armored attack against the village of Pogrebki. From what I understand, the Ukrainians started some sort of withdrawal. Then the Russian commander of the 810th Marine Brigade saw this opportunity and charged right in. And fell straight into minefields. The remaining units were then chased down by swarms of FPV drones. It seems the plan was the following. One column attacked this way from the west, one from the center, and another from this direction to swarm the village. Overall, 3 vehicles were lost here, another 3 here, and 2 here. The ones that pushed on were later destroyed at the exit of the village. Russian sources were very angry at what they called a stupid attack, which was apparently not supported by any type of engineering vehicles or mine trawls. Russian sources also claimed that by looking at the footage, 2 companies worth of armored vehicles were lost. Another source mentioned how out of 14 BTR-82A engaged, 10 were destroyed or abandoned, plus a number of tanks. Yet this seems to have been one attack as part of a large operation to destroy the Ukrainian salient in Kursk Oblast. Because 24 hours after this debacle, the Russians launched another attack south of Lyubimovka, this time with more success, as the entire west bank of the Snagos River came under their control. Meanwhile, this M1A1 Abrams was hit by a Russian drone guided on fiber optics. Here we got another such strike. As you can imagine, this hindered Ukrainian capabilities to counterattack. Alright, so attack from the north, one attack towards the Snagos River. Now the Russian command also launched major assaults towards Nova Ivanovka. But there too, they ran straight into a wall. We can see this Russian column composed of 1 T-72 and 5 BMP-2s that managed to disembark their infantry component in some urban sector. Yet here you can see the aftermath of the attack with a number of Russian armored vehicles destroyed and abandoned. They were ambushed by a combined effort by units of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the 225th Assault Battalion, and the 2nd Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade. Those are all some of Ukraine's most elite formations. Then we have a little bit more insight as to how the Ukrainians managed to repulse these Russian attacks. We don't have the details, but it seems that a lot of the damage to Russian armored vehicles was done using remotely installed mines. Reportedly, to carry on the offensive, the Russian command called for more reinforcements. That's how the 104th Guards Air Assault Regiment was now deployed around the Kursk Salient. There's so many Russian airborne units now in that sector that I'm starting to lose track of who's who. Now we have 6 airborne formations on the Kursk theater, and with the 104th Regiment, this marks the arrival of the 76th Airborne Division that was previously deployed in the Kreminna sector. This means the Russian command essentially withdrew all the capable formations positioned around the Siversk salient and transferred them all to Kursk. At this rate, instead of the Soviet shock armies, the Russian Ministry of Defense will be able to form airborne armies. And the irony is that there's nothing aerial about these formations anymore. Now on the 13th of November, according to drone footage of the Ukrainian 129th Territorial Defense Brigade, Russian forces got a foothold inside the village of Pliehava. With the river in their back, it will be very hard for the Ukrainians to hold these positions. The next day, we have footage from the western side of the salient, where Bradley fired 2 TOW anti-tank missiles at the same tree line south of Vyeseloye. Is our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia getting ready for a round 2 and to clap Russian cheeks near Glushkova? No major Russian attacks could be reported in this past week of November. However, like you can see in these images, the increasing number of strikes on Ukrainian armored vehicles using fiber optic drones was starting to become worrying for the Ukrainian command. Same thing for infantry units. On the 17th of November, an FPV drone managed to hit right into a tightly packed crowd of about 50 Ukrainian soldiers. Due to the attrition and overstretched defensive lines, the Ukrainians enacted a set of tactical withdrawals. A first one on the 18th of November, north of Pabrepki, followed by a larger one 2 days later on the 20th of November, where they abandoned this entire forested area. Overall, these Russian armored assaults of the past few weeks led to a lot of burnt steel. And in a way, this time the geography actually helped the Ukrainians. With all the mud, the few roads available quickly became lethal bottlenecks for the attacker. Here on this map, every red dot is essentially geolocated Russian losses of equipment. And that's just for October and November. Look at the concentration of red dots near Abukhovka. I counted about 25, 18 in and around Lyubimovka, or here on the highway to hell near Zeleny Shlier, 28 red dots. And on the northern sector of the salient around Pabrepki, I counted 26 red dots. To be honest, at this point, we can consider the Battle of Kursk to be considered as a stalemate.
Hey, yo, what the?
On one end, the Russians did not manage to clear out the Ukrainian salient in Kursk Oblast. On the other, what was even the point of this Kursk offensive for Ukraine? From a military perspective, General Syrsky said, one of the objectives of the offensive operation in the Kursk direction was to divert significant enemy forces from other directions, primarily from the Pokrovsk and Kurakhove directions. Alright, so if that was the military objective, then it clearly failed. With that being said, the Russians did divert a lot of resources and manpower from secondary fronts. The Russian command essentially put to a full stop combat operations near Chasiv Yar and in and around the Siversk salient. And same thing for this Russian offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, which came to a full stop. I mean, look at the Russian progress in Vovchansk. 0. So in a way, we could say that the Ukrainian Kursk offensive prevented the Ukrainian front to collapse in other sectors. But even then, it's hard to justify considering the current shortage of manpower and equipment that the AFU is facing. General Syrsky could have simply kept these 10,000 well-trained and well-equipped soldiers in reserve and only bring them forward for quick counterattacks. Not only these elite formations would have been preserved, but this would have also certainly helped to stabilize the front. So there must have been something else that triggered this Kursk offensive. And to do so, we have to look at the political perspective. What I think is that Ukrainian authorities expected Donald Trump to be the most likely winner of the next US election. They knew what he thought of this war, and it wasn't very positive. On the 19th of July, from Politico, Trump and Zelensky held a phone call. Trump said that he will work to negotiate a peace deal between Moscow and Kyiv. Although Zelensky publicly announced that this talk was very good and the partnership was better than ever, behind the scene, this was a disaster. Ukraine would essentially lose the war. So now I speculate that President Zelensky, General Syrskyi, and a narrow circle prepared a secret operation to make sure peace talks fail, by making sure Russia refuses to freeze the front, thus forcing Trump to continue to support Ukraine. This is the only way I can rationalize the Kursk operation. And Ukraine's stubbornness to hold the salient to the extent of even sending their most elite formations there, while the entire Donbass front is collapsing. If my theory is correct, not only are the Ukrainians going to reinforce the bridgehead, they might even double down. And once Trump enters the White House, if he finally decides to continue military support to Ukraine, then we could suddenly see the Ukrainian command withdraw all its forces from Kursk Oblast, stating that it was mission accomplished. And just like the Tet Offensive for North Vietnam, military defeat, political victory. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.